Africa was not discovered, it was interrupted, ripped from its rhythm, its harmony fractured by foreign hands wielding maps and muskets. They came not with curiosity, but with conquest, not with reverence, but with rulers and red ink, measuring what they did not understand, dividing what was never theirs. And history for too long has told their version, filtered through the eyes of colonizers, printed in textbooks that celebrate theft as exploration and erase glory with silence. But before their ships kissed the shores of Africa, before their flags were planted in lands older than their languages, Africa thrived. Not merely survived, thrived. This was a continent of empires, of ingenuity, of people who mapped the stars and healed with roots. From the royal courts of Mali to the stone towers of Great Zimbabwe, from the flowing robes of the Fulani scholars in Timbuktu to the Oba's bronze-covered kingdom in Benin, Africa was alive with power, complexity and civilization. There were kings who ruled with wisdom and warriors who defended with honor. There were trade routes stretching like arteries across the land, gold, ivory, salt, knowledge, flowing not just through markets but through the very lifeblood of the continent. There were languages as lyrical as songs and philosophies that questioned the soul. There were systems, governments, economies, education, all in place long before a European foot touched African soil. And yet, history dares to ask, who discovered Africa? They called it the Dark Continent, not because it was unknown, but because they chose to turn a blind eye to its brilliance. Darkness, not in the absence of civilization, but in the blindness of the West. They saw jungles where there were cities. They saw savagery where there was spirituality. They saw land to be taken, people to be chained, cultures to be dismantled. And they wrote the story as if they had the right to begin it. This documentary will not repeat that lie. It will not sanitize savagery with soft language. It will not glorify the gunboats or romanticize the missionaries' Bible. It will speak truth, unflinching and unfiltered. Because the story of Africa is not a side note in European expansion, it is a saga of strength, a chronicle of kingdoms crushed but never conquered, of people displaced but never erased. This is the story they didn't want you to know. The story of how the world's richest continent was plundered for its people, its gold, its diamonds, its soul, and how, despite everything, it breathes still. So as you watch, listen deeply, not just with your ears, but with your spirit. Feel the weight of lost names. Hear the echo of languages stolen. Let your understanding be unshackled. Because this isn't about the past alone. It's about how the past lives in us, in every border drawn in Berlin, in every language lost, in every African who still struggles to piece together the fragments of identity. Africa was not a blank canvas, it was a masterpiece already painted. And though they tried to whitewash it with empire, the colours remain. Faded, yes, but never forgotten. And now, brush in hand, we begin to restore the truth. Welcome to the real history of Africa. Before the storm broke across Africa's skies, before the sails of Europe cast shadows on its coasts, there was a continent that knew itself. Whole, mighty and alive with its own pulse. The winds of the Sahara whispered stories of kings. The rivers, Nile, Niger, Congo, moved like serpents of history, connecting realms and lives. Africa was not waiting to be found. It was already speaking in 1,000 voices, each echoing its own legacy. This was a land of empires, not villages clinging to survival. In the north, there was Egypt. Timeless, glorious, a cradle of civilization. Its pyramids scraped the heavens long before Rome was conceived, and its philosophies shaped early thought long before Aristotle ever put ink to scroll. The Nile wasn't merely a river, it was the thread that stitched a civilization together, a symbol of life and power. But Egypt was only one jewel in Africa's crown. Further west, the Empire of Ghana rose, not to be confused with the modern nation, but a mighty medieval kingdom forged in gold and held firm by iron. It flourished in the 7th century, with trade routes running through its heart carrying salt, ivory and ideas between African peoples and the Arab world. The rulers of Ghana didn't need foreign approval. They commanded wealth beyond European imagination. They built cities before many in Europe even had roads. In the 14th century, the Mali Empire under Mansa Musa didn't just rule West Africa, it dazzled the world. Musa's pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324 was so extravagant that it destabilized the gold markets of Cairo and Medina. He didn't come as a servant of Islam, he came as a king of kings, draped in gold, commanding thousands. And when he returned, he built mosques, libraries, universities, most notably in Timbuktu, a city whose very name still sings with mystery. There, African scholars debated philosophy, law and astronomy, preserving manuscripts and knowledge while Europe staggered through its dark ages. Timbuktu was not a myth, it was a lighthouse of thought in the medieval world. To the south, the Kingdom of Zimbabwe rose from stone, literally. Great Zimbabwe, with its towering stone enclosures and intricate architecture, stood as a testament to African engineering and statecraft. It was a center of trade and religion, connected to the Swahili coast, and through it, the Indian Ocean world. Gold and cattle flowed through its gates. No colonizer built it. No outsider taught them how. They needed no blueprint from beyond. They were enough. Eastward, along the Swahili coast, African city-states like Kilwa, Mombasa and Zanzibar became cosmopolitan hubs, buzzing with trade from Persia, India and Arabia. These were cities of coral stone, with towering minarets and spice-laden markets, where Bantu languages mingled with Arabic, creating a unique cultural and linguistic fusion known today as Kiswahili. A language born not from conquest, but from centuries of coastal interaction, trade and mutual exchange. This wasn't a sign of Africa being overrun or reshaped by outsiders, quite the opposite. Africa absorbed the world on its own terms. The Swahili city-states were self-governing and powerful, their rulers engaging with Muslim merchants as equals, not subordinates. Their ports glittered with Persian ceramics, Chinese silks and Indian spices. And yet their customs, governance and worldview remained deeply rooted in African soil. Africa's coasts were open but not vulnerable. For hundreds of years, Europeans did not dare to press deep inland. They lacked the knowledge, the immunity, the means. Africa's geography protected her. Her forests, rivers and deserts were not merely terrain, they were barriers that shielded the interior from European intrusion. What few Europeans knew of Africa came through second-hand accounts from Arab traders or exaggerated tales wrapped in myth. To the European imagination, Africa was a land of endless riches guarded by mystery and danger. But the reality was far more grounded and formidable. When the Portuguese finally rounded the Cape of Good Hope in the late 15th century, led by Bartolomeu Dias and later Vasco da Gama, they did not find a land of wandering nomads. They encountered established states with well-armed militaries, regulated markets, and structured diplomacy. In the Kingdom of Congo, for instance, they met a centralized monarchy with its own legal system, social hierarchy, and military tradition. The Congolese king, Nzinga Nkuwu, even converted to Christianity in 1491 and adopted the name Joao I, not out of submission, but as a strategic diplomatic alliance. Christianity in this context was not forced upon the kingdom. It was negotiated, translated and adapted into a Congolese framework. But behind the rituals of conversion and the gestures of goodwill, something more ominous simmered. The Portuguese, and later the Dutch, the French and the British, were not merely explorers or missionaries. They were agents of empire, driven by mercantile hunger and imperial ambition. Their interactions with African rulers were often transactional, calculated, and increasingly unequal. They studied the political rivalries between kingdoms and ethnic groups, identifying weaknesses to exploit. Over time, trade turned into dependency. Africans traded gold, ivory and spices, resources extracted from their own land, but what they increasingly received in return were weapons, liquor, textiles and later, shackles. The Atlantic slave trade didn't begin in full force right away. It crept in like a poison, disguised as commerce, masked as opportunity. And while African rulers initially controlled the pace and terms of this trade, The Europeans began to manipulate it with devastating skill. They offered incentives that sowed division. They provided guns to some kingdoms, encouraging them to raid their neighbors. They built forts, not just to protect themselves, but to dominate the trade routes. Elmina Castle, erected by the Portuguese on the Gold Coast in 1482, was among the first of many. It was a fortress, a trading post, and eventually a prison for human cargo. And though this marked the beginning of a darker chapter, Africa had not yet been broken. Within the continent, power still resided in African hands. The empires of Mali and Songhai, though facing internal strains, still commanded respect and territory. In West Africa, kingdoms like Dahomey and Asante rose with fierce independence, developing complex systems of governance and formidable military organizations. In the south, the Zulu and the Sotho would not even emerge as major powers until centuries later. Africa was dynamic, not static, as colonial historians once claimed. But even as the continent's interior continued to flourish and adapt, the external pressures mounted. European maps began to feature African coastlines with increasing accuracy. Port after port was marked, first as a stopover, then as a possession. The coasts became staging grounds, laboratories for imperial experiments. And behind every transaction, every handshake, there was an assumption growing in European minds that Africa was not a partner, but a prize. Still, this was not yet colonization. What unfolded in these early centuries was economic infiltration, not political domination. The Africans controlled the land. The Europeans controlled the seas, but the tides were shifting. Europe's thirst for control, for resources, for labor, would soon evolve into a hunger that could not be satisfied with trade alone. They wanted the land, the people, the power. And so, while Africa still stood, still reigned, still resisted, the seeds of future subjugation had been sown. The continent's brilliance remained undeniable, but the shadows were lengthening. The interruption was no longer a distant threat. It was beginning to take shape. The centuries ahead would test Africa's sovereignty like never before. As empires in Europe consolidated power and industrialization accelerated their hunger, Africa would become the stage of one of the most brutal and systematic acts of theft in human history. The story was no longer about trade or diplomacy. It was about who would own the narrative of the continent's future. And thus, the storm approached. Not with a single thunderclap, but with the quiet, relentless march of foreign feet onto African soil. They didn't come all at once. They came like whispers on the wind. First the Portuguese, then the Dutch, the French, the British. They came not in legions but in caravels and merchant ships, flying banners, wielding Bibles and bearing muskets. To the coastal kingdoms of Africa, these newcomers were curiosities. Strange in dress, pale of skin, their languages guttural and foreign, but not necessarily threatening. At first they asked permission to dock, to barter, to build. They bowed to kings and knelt before chiefs, presenting trinkets, steel tools and rum in exchange for access to Africa's coastlines. In those early days, Europe was not yet powerful enough to conquer Africa. The continent was no stranger to foreign visitors. Arabs had been navigating its trade routes for centuries, but the Europeans brought a different hunger. They were not content with exchange. What they sought was extraction. Africa had what Europe lacked: gold, ivory, pepper, timber, and most importantly, people. The burgeoning plantations of the Americas, from Brazil to the Caribbean, were ravenous for labor. And as indigenous populations perished under disease and cruelty, the eyes of Europe turned ever more greedily toward Africa. The Portuguese were the first to establish permanent footholds, with trading posts like Elmina on the Gold Coast. What began as commerce gradually evolved into captivity. Human beings were no longer dignitaries or warriors or traders, they were stock. The early slaving missions were small, hundreds, then thousands. Africans captured by rival tribes or condemned criminals were sold to the Portuguese, who shackled them below decks, stacked like firewood, breathing recycled air thick with fear and filth. The voyage across the Atlantic, the Middle Passage, was a crucible of death. 1 in 5 would never see land again. At first, African leaders controlled the trade. They decided who was sold and when. But this sense of control was an illusion that would evaporate with time. The Europeans began to stoke rivalries between kingdoms, arming one to raid another, creating a cycle of violence and dependency. Tribes that had once coexisted began to turn on each other, incentivized by muskets and foreign gold. Kingdoms like Dahomey and Oyo grew rich and powerful on the back of this trade, constructing economies that fed off conflict and sale. But the cost, human, cultural, spiritual, was catastrophic. Africa was bleeding, communities were hollowed out, generations of potential artisans, thinkers, farmers, warriors were severed from the land and shipped away. And it wasn't just the bodies, it was the identity. Entire belief systems were uprooted, oral traditions were disrupted, languages faded from memory. The trauma didn't just echo through time, it etched itself into the very DNA of the continent. The Europeans, for their part, masked their brutality in righteousness. They called it civilizing. They saw themselves not as thieves, but as saviors. The Bible was weaponized as much as the gun. Missionaries arrived on African shores not just to preach Christ, but to reshape the African soul. They condemned traditional religions as barbaric, animist practices as devilish. They built churches and schools, but behind the altar was always the flag. Conversion was the first step toward control. Yet still, Europe did not dare to invade the heart of Africa. They lingered at the edges, content, for now, to extract and manipulate. Inland kingdoms still ruled with confidence. The Asante, with their golden stool and warrior tradition, the Fulani, who led Islamic revivals across the Sahel, the Ethiopians, defenders of ancient Christian dynasties. In the south, the rise of the Zulu under Shaka signaled a fierce consolidation of power and identity. Africa was wounded, but it was not conquered. But European ambition does not stall. It waits. It recalibrates. As the Industrial Revolution took hold in the 18th and 19th centuries, the stakes changed. Coal and steel turned empires into machines. Europe needed raw materials for factories and markets for finished goods. They looked across the seas and saw Africa not just as a source, but as a frontier to be consumed. The contact that had once been diplomatic now turned surgical. They began to map the continent, not just its coasts, but its rivers, its mountains, its people. Explorers were dispatched, draped in colonial pride: Mungo Park, David Livingstone, Henry Morton Stanley. These men were hailed as heroes in Europe, lionized as brave souls who discovered rivers and lakes Africans had known for millennia. They came armed with journals and compasses, but also with prejudice. Their reports painted Africa as a land of darkness, its people childlike, in need of European guidance. The stage was being set, not just for plunder, but for possession. The lines between trade, religion and conquest blurred. Every missionary outpost was a potential military foothold, every trader's warehouse a future barracks. Treaties were signed under duress, in languages kings did not speak, promising land and loyalty in exchange for guns and peace. But peace never came. What came instead was the sound of cannons, the arrival of colonial administrators and the slicing of Africa into pieces on European maps. The roots of exploitation had been laid with quiet deceit. The tree would soon bear its most bitter fruit: colonization. And as European powers prepared to divide the continent amongst themselves like loot from a raid, Africa stood on the precipice of the greatest theft in its history, one that would reshape not only its borders, but its very soul. It happened in cold rooms, velvet-draped halls in Berlin, far removed from the soil they were about to violate. In 1884, European leaders gathered, not in war, not in bloodshed, but in bureaucracy. They sat around a table at the invitation of Germany's Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, a man who, ironically, had shown little prior interest in Africa. But power has gravity, and where there is land to be claimed, men will always gather. The Berlin Conference was not a negotiation with Africa, it was a carving of it. No African leader was present. Not a single representative from the kingdoms, empires, or ethnic nations whose fates were being decided. Their lands, their resources, their people, discussed and diced like portions on a dinner plate. The conference was clinical, diplomatic, and devastating. It wasn't about cooperation, it was about avoidance of conflict. Europe didn't want to fight itself. It wanted to feast undisturbed. And so, in less than a year, they drew borders with rulers and ink, dividing the continent with straight lines and careless curves that ignored tribes, languages, rivers and mountains. Nations were sliced in two, and enemies forced into shared colonies. It was cartographic violence, damage done with pen and paper. The Berlin Conference formalized what had already begun. The rush to claim African territory exploded into a frenzy. Britain raced for the Nile, France plunged deeper into West Africa, Belgium's King Leopold reached for the Congo with greedy, blood-soaked fingers. Italy eyed the Horn, Portugal clung to the coasts, and Germany, newly unified and hungry, pounced on Tanzania, Namibia, and Cameroon. The map of Africa transformed almost overnight, from a land of independent African states to a checkerboard of European flags. This was not colonization as imagined by poets or textbooks. This was conquest, swift, brutal, systematic. In North Africa, the French stormed Algeria with fanatical cruelty. Entire towns were burned. Resistance was met with collective punishment. Farms salted, water poisoned. In West Africa, the mighty samurai tour of the Wassoulou Empire fought fiercely, using scorched earth tactics, modern firearms and brilliant strategy. But he was outgunned and eventually exiled. In what is now Sudan, the Mahdist revolt rose against Anglo-Egyptian domination, culminating in the bloody siege of Khartoum. The British returned with vengeance and machine guns. In the east, Ethiopia stood defiant. Under the brilliant leadership of Emperor Menelik II, the Ethiopian army, armed not just with courage but with modern weaponry, shattered Italian forces at the Battle of Adwa in 1896. It was a stunning moment, an African victory, a blow to European arrogance. The world watched in disbelief, but Ethiopia was the exception, not the rule. Most resistance was drowned in blood. The Zulu Empire, once feared across the south, fell to British firepower at Ulundi. The Herero and Nama peoples of Namibia faced something even darker: genocide. German troops systematically hunted, executed and starved tens of thousands, forcing survivors into the desert, where they died of thirst and disease. It was one of the first genocides of the 20th century. Before the Holocaust, before Rwanda, and yet it remains a ghost in history books, barely acknowledged, deeply buried. The justification for this carnage was cloaked in ideology. The Europeans told themselves they were civilizing, that Africans were children, that colonial rule was a burden they carried, a white man's burden. They spoke of roads and railways, of schools and sanitation, but the truth was always about wealth. Africa's land was rich: rubber in the Congo, gold in South Africa, cotton in Egypt, cocoa in Ghana, diamonds, uranium, oil. The colonizers extracted relentlessly, leaving behind scars where mountains once stood and rivers once ran free. They laid railways, yes, but only from mines to ports. Roads led to plantations, not villages. Infrastructure was built for plunder, not progress. Traditional systems of governance were destroyed. Chiefs were replaced with colonial puppets. African kings were dethroned, humiliated, or assassinated. Indigenous religions were mocked or outlawed. Colonial education did not empower, it erased. Children were taught European history, European heroes, European languages. They were taught to look down on their own ancestors, to see their traditions as savage, to speak their mother tongues only in whispers. But perhaps the most insidious damage was psychological. Colonization didn't just take land, it reshaped identity. Africans were told they were inferior, incapable of ruling themselves. Generations grew up under flags that were not theirs, learning hymns that were not sung by their grandmothers, saluting monarchs they had never seen. The goal was not just to control the land, but to own the mind. By the early 20th century, almost 90% of Africa had been colonized. Only Ethiopia and Liberia remained nominally free. But even in freedom, they were not untouched. Economic pressure, diplomatic isolation, and cultural infiltration weighed heavily. Meanwhile, across the continent, colonial administrations settled in, drawing wages from African labor, growing rich off the backs of the very people they claimed to help. But beneath the surface, resistance simmered in secret societies and hidden songs, in stolen pamphlets and whispered plans, in the memories of ancestors and the pride that no rifle could extinguish. Because Africa was never fully conquered, it was interrupted. And though the map had changed, and though European flags flew from Cape Town to Cairo, something far greater was beginning to stir. The next chapter would not be written by Europe, it would be forged in the fires of rebellion. Colonization did not end with conquest. It only began there. Once the flags were planted, once the treaties were signed, many at gunpoint, many forged, the real machinery of European domination began to turn. And it turned slowly, grinding through cultures, identities and lives with mechanical precision. The goal was never integration, it was never partnership, it was control, absolute, total, unquestionable control. And so the strategy was simple: divide and rule. The colonial powers understood one thing with chilling clarity: unity among Africans was dangerous. Dangerous to their profits, dangerous to their lies, dangerous to their empire. So they sowed division like seeds in every colony. Ethnic groups that had coexisted for centuries were suddenly classified, ranked and separated by artificial lines. In Rwanda, the Belgians elevated the Tutsi minority over the Hutu majority, using pseudoscience and absurd racial theories to create a hierarchy where none had existed. Identity cards were issued, power was transferred, distrust was manufactured, and what began as policy would one day become genocide. In Nigeria, the British pitted the North against the South Muslims, against Christians, Hausa Fulani, against Igbo and Yoruba. They empowered emirs in the north to maintain a system of indirect rule while centralizing bureaucracy in the south. It was a two-speed colony, fragmented by design. In Kenya, fertile lands were seized from indigenous communities and handed to white settlers, displacing Kikuyu farmers and fueling resentment that would erupt decades later in the Mau Mau uprising. The French, in their colonies, pursued assimilation, a lie disguised as opportunity. They claimed Africans could become French if they embraced French language, French culture, French values, but no African was ever truly equal in the eyes of the Republic. Not in Senegal, not in Algeria, not in Madagascar. The so-called évolués, Africans who dressed in suits, spoke perfect French and embraced Parisian ideals, were tolerated, never welcomed. Their advancement was a mirage, a leash disguised as progress. In the Congo, under King Leopold II of Belgium, what happened wasn't colonization, it was terror. The Congo Free State was Leopold's personal possession, not even officially part of Belgium. Here, rubber became blood. Entire villages were mutilated for failing to meet rubber quotas. Hands were severed. Children were burned alive. Women were taken hostage to force the labor of their husbands. An estimated 10 million Congolese died in less than 3 decades. 10 million, not in war, not in famine, but in silence. A silence enforced by whips and rifles and the deafness of the so-called civilized world. Meanwhile, education under colonization was weaponized. Schools were built not to enlighten but to indoctrinate. Africans were taught that their histories began with European contact, that their gods were false, that their traditions were backward. That salvation came with a white face and a Christian cross. Only the lucky few were even educated, just enough to serve as clerks, translators and loyal intermediaries. The rest were left to labor in fields, dig in mines or build infrastructure that would serve only colonial extraction. Roads led to ports, railways led to plantations. Africans were not the passengers, they were the cargo. Laws were passed that criminalized resistance. Entire legal systems were imposed to protect the colonizer, not the colonized. In British colonies, ordinances gave police unchecked powers. In French colonies, forced labor, known as corvée, was institutionalized. Men, women, even children were rounded up and compelled to work without pay, without rest, often without return. Across southern Africa, the pass system controlled every movement of black bodies. Papers had to be shown to travel, to work, to live. Without them, arrests were swift, brutal and common. The police and military forces were composed of Africans trained and armed by Europeans to oppress their own. These askaris and tirailleurs were often forced into service, coerced by poverty or threat. They became the enforcers of a system designed to strip their own people of dignity. Some complied, others broke under the weight of shame. But many resisted, from within or from afar. Revolts were frequent but rarely successful. Weapons were scarce, ammunition was limited, and the colonizers responded with overwhelming force. Economic policies reinforced dependence. African economies were restructured to serve European markets. Cash crops replaced food crops, leading to recurring famines. Cotton in Sudan, cocoa in Ghana, groundnuts in Senegal. These were grown not for local consumption but for export. The profits went overseas, the poverty stayed behind. African industry was stifled, manufacturing was discouraged, sometimes outright banned. The continent was kept in a state of permanent extraction, rich in resources, poor in power. And culture? Culture was ridiculed. Traditional dress, dance, language, music, all labelled primitive or pagan. Churches replaced shrines. European names replaced ancestral ones. Missionaries arrived with Bibles and blueprints, determined to save the soul while destroying the identity. Some conversions were sincere, others were the price of survival. Either way, the cost was the same, erasure. But even in this bleakness, something stirred beneath the surface. Stories continued in hidden tongues. Drumbeats survived under the stars. Griots whispered genealogies in secret. Dancers moved with memories in their bones. The flame of identity flickered, fragile but unextinguished. And slowly, the colonized began to see the cracks in the empire. They saw Europeans bleed in world wars. They saw that colonizers could die, could fall, could be defeated. They saw that the myth of white invincibility was just that, a myth. They saw hope, and they began to organize. Trade unions, student movements, underground newspapers, exiled leaders all began to form a chorus. It was quiet at first, tentative, but it was growing. It would become a roar. Colonialism had come with brute force and quiet lies. But the next chapter would come with fire. It was time to fight for freedom. You cannot chain a people forever. You can whip their backs, silence their tongues, bury their traditions beneath stone cathedrals and foreign flags, but you cannot kill the spirit of freedom. Not in Africa, not ever. Long before the official independence movements of the 20th century, Africa was already in revolt. The soil was soaked, not just with colonial greed, but with defiance. Rebellions flickered like scattered wildfires, often crushed, often forgotten, but always burning under the surface, waiting for air. From the moment European boots stepped ashore, resistance began. In 1896, in the highlands of Ethiopia, Emperor Menelik II dealt a devastating blow to Italian imperial ambition at the Battle of Adwa. Against the odds, his forces defeated the well-armed Italian army, humiliating a European power and sending a message to every colony on the continent: Africa could fight back. Adwa wasn't just a battle, it was a prophecy. In Zimbabwe, then southern Rhodesia, spiritual leader Mbuya Nehanda led the Shona people in an armed uprising against British occupation in the 1890s. Before she was executed by hanging, her final words echoed through time. "My bones will rise again." They did. In Senegal, Samori Touré built a resistance empire that took the French decades to dismantle. In Sudan, the Mahdist revolt struck at Anglo-Egyptian control. In Ghana, the Ashanti Wars raged fiercely as Yaa Asantewaa, the Queen Mother, took up arms when the men faltered, leading a legendary resistance against the British in 1900. Her rallying cry, that if the men would not fight, then the women would. And they did. But the colonial powers learned to crush uprisings with swift brutality and calculated propaganda. Every act of resistance was painted as savagery, rebellion, irrationality. Colonial officers wrote reports. Missionaries called for calm. European newspapers spun tales of ungrateful natives turning on their civilizing saviors. Yet behind the lies, Africa was waking up. World War I and World War II would become unexpected catalysts. Colonized Africans were conscripted into European wars they neither started nor benefited from. They fought in foreign trenches, shed blood for flags not their own, and returned to their homelands changed. They had seen white men afraid, seen them bleed, seen that they were not gods. The myth of invincibility cracked. In the post-war years, political consciousness surged. In cities like Accra, Lagos, Nairobi, Dakar and Kinshasa, African intellectuals began to gather. They met in cafes, university halls, churches, printing presses. They spoke of independence, not just of territory, but of the mind. They studied the revolutions of America, France, Haiti. They read Marx, Lenin, Garvey, Du Bois. They listened to radio broadcasts from the Soviet Union, from the US, from newly independent India. The winds of change were no longer whispers, they were storms. Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, Patrice Lumumba of the Congo, Jomo Kenyatta of Kenya, Julius Nyerere of Tanzania, Amilcar Cabral of Guinea-Bissau, Sekou Touré of Guinea, Ahmed Ben Bella of Algeria. These were not just men, they were movements, they were visions. They formed political parties that were banned. So they went underground. They held rallies that were attacked. So they organized in secret. They were arrested, exiled, tortured. But they returned, louder. Colonial governments responded with violence. Massacres were no longer rare. In Kenya, the British detained over 1 million Kikuyu in concentration camps during the Mau Mau uprising. Torture, forced labor, sexual abuse, executions, all hidden under bureaucratic terms like detention and rehabilitation. In Algeria, the French fought a bloody 8-year war to maintain their so-called département. Over 1 million Algerians died. The French military used torture openly, even proudly. But they couldn't silence the will of a people. Across the continent, even peaceful protests were met with bullets. In 1948, black mineworkers in South Africa marched for better wages. Police opened fire. In 1955, over 3,000 people signed the Freedom Charter demanding equality, only to be rounded up and charged with treason. In 1960, in the township of Sharpeville, peaceful demonstrators protesting pass laws were gunned down, 69 dead, many shot in the back. But repression no longer worked, it only sharpened the cry. Independence was no longer a dream, it was a demand. Music joined the fight, so did poetry. The drums that had once been silenced now pulsed in rebellion. Fela Kuti in Nigeria used Afrobeat to mock dictators and colonial remnants. Writers like Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Chinua Achebe and Wole Soyinka penned searing critiques of both the colonizer and the corrupt elites they left behind. Women were central. In Guinea, market women led boycotts. In Nigeria, they marched in the thousands to protest taxes. In South Africa, they stood before apartheid's iron walls chanting, "You strike a woman, you strike a rock." Their courage carried families, communities, revolutions. Pan-Africanism became more than a philosophy, it became a lifeline. Africans abroad, like Malcolm X, Marcus Garvey and C.L.R. James, called for solidarity, pride and return. Caribbean nations lent their voices. African Americans looked to the continent not with pity but with power. By the 1950s and 60s, the Great Wave had begun. Ghana, under Nkrumah, became the first sub-Saharan country to gain independence in 1957. The dominoes followed: Nigeria in 1960, Tanzania in 1961, Uganda in 1962, Kenya in 1963. Even the mighty French Empire began to break. Guinea chose immediate independence in 1958 and was punished with the sudden withdrawal of all French support, but they stood firm. "We prefer freedom in poverty to slavery in riches," Sekou Touré declared. But freedom came unevenly. Some nations won it through negotiation, others through fire and blood. Some inherited stability. Most inherited chaos. Artificial borders, corrupted systems and economies still yoked to Europe. The colonizer may have left the house, but he'd taken the roof, the furniture and the keys. And still, hope endured. Africa was not a broken thing begging to be fixed. It was a wounded lion sharpening its claws. The seeds of revolt had grown into trees, and those trees were breaking fences. And among them, new voices emerged. Voices that spoke not just of liberation, but of reclamation, identity, sovereignty, power. One such voice would be Traoré. But that is the future. First, the ghosts of colonialism must be confronted. The independence flags were raised, but what came after? The battle, it turned out, was far from over. The flags were raised, the anthems composed. The colonial masters packed their bags, boarded planes and handed over the keys. On paper, Africa was free, sovereign, independent. But independence was never a gift. It was a carefully crafted illusion. And what followed was not liberation, it was substitution. Neocolonialism does not wear a crown or carry a whip. It smiles through diplomats, signs contracts in boardrooms, and offers aid with one hand while reaching into your treasury with the other. The physical chains had been broken, but invisible ones remained, stronger, more insidious, and far more enduring. As the dust settled across the continent in the 1960s, many African nations discovered they were inheriting hollow shells of statehood. Economies still revolved around the export of raw materials to Europe. Industries had never been developed, deliberately stunted to prevent competition. Education systems were modeled to create clerks, not thinkers. Languages, borders, and even national identities had been imposed by outsiders. And into this fragile landscape stepped the first generation of African leaders. Many idealists, many revolutionaries. But revolution is a dangerous business when your enemies wear suits and not uniforms. Kwame Nkrumah, the fiery architect of Ghana's independence, dreamed of a united Africa, one army, one currency, one voice. But dreams are threats in the world of empire. He was overthrown in 1966 in a CIA-backed coup. His vision shattered, his country plunged into economic chaos. Patrice Lumumba, the eloquent and brilliant Prime Minister of the newly independent Congo, refused to bow to Belgian and American pressure. He was beaten, humiliated, and eventually assassinated with Western complicity. His body dissolved in acid, his voice silenced, but not forgotten. Across the continent, leaders who dared to challenge the old colonial powers were removed, replaced, or killed. Guinea-Bissau's Amilcar Cabral assassinated. Burkina Faso's Thomas Sankara gunned down. Even Nelson Mandela, while revered now, was branded a terrorist and imprisoned for 27 years. What filled the vacuum was worse. Authoritarianism became the norm. Many of the new rulers, whether placed by foreign powers or corrupted by personal ambition, began to turn against their people. Power was addictive. Palaces replaced parliaments, secret police replaced public service, dissent was labelled treason. In Uganda, Idi Amin ruled with terror and whim. In Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of Congo, Mobutu Sese Seko, installed with Western support, looted his country for decades, while wearing leopard print hats and hosting foreign dignitaries like a parody of African royalty. In Nigeria, military coups became so frequent that by the 1980s, no one could keep track of who was in charge. But the betrayal was not always violent. Sometimes it came dressed in diplomacy. France, for example, created the CFA franc, its own colonial currency system, for 14 African countries. These nations would have to keep at least 50% of their foreign exchange reserves in French banks. To this day, France profits off African wealth under the guise of monetary stability. It is control without colonization, a leash without a collar. The International Monetary Fund and World Bank entered the scene next, promising loans and development packages. But these came with strings, structural adjustment programs that gutted public services, deregulated markets, and opened African economies to foreign exploitation. Healthcare collapsed, schools crumbled, prices soared, but the debt remained. It was not that Africa was incapable of governing itself, it was that it had been deliberately set up to fail again and again. Multinational corporations became the new colonizers. They mined gold in Ghana, oil in Nigeria, diamonds in Angola. They polluted rivers, displaced villages, bribed officials and paid no taxes. The profits flowed out of Africa, while the consequences, poverty, corruption, environmental destruction, were left behind. And while the West demonized African leaders as corrupt, it was often Western banks that held the stolen money. Swiss accounts, London mansions, Paris getaways. The corruption was global. The hypocrisy, breathtaking. Meanwhile, the people suffered. Children grew up never knowing clean water. Families fled civil wars sparked by colonial borders and fueled by foreign arms. Diseases like HIV, Ebola and malaria spread while pharmaceutical companies patented the cures and priced them out of reach. And when Africans fled these manufactured crises, they were labelled migrants, illegals, invaders. The media joined the theatre. Africa was portrayed as a continent of beggars and brutes, of endless war and hopeless poverty. Its history erased, its achievements ignored, its pain turned into charity campaigns and saviour complexes. The very powers that had broken Africa now presented themselves as its healers. But amid this darkness, the embers of resistance never died. Grassroots movements began to grow again. Writers, musicians, filmmakers, new griots began telling the real stories. Technology gave voice to the voiceless. Diaspora communities began to reconnect with their roots, asking hard questions and demanding real change. The illusion of independence was breaking. Africa was not defeated, it was betrayed again and again. But betrayal breeds anger, and anger, if focused, becomes power. The new generation knew their history now, not the colonial version, but the truth. They were no longer content with symbolic freedom. They wanted justice, equity, dignity. And from the shadows of the past, a new symbol began to rise. A name that would not be whispered but shouted. Traore, a child of revolution, a product of pain, a vessel of hope. But before we look forward, we must descend deeper into the scars that remain, into the trauma that continues to shape Africa's soul. Because to rise, you must first remember why you fell. And Africa remembers. They say a nation can recover from war. It can rebuild cities, mend economies, even replant forests, burn to ash. But the most lasting damage is not to infrastructure, it is to memory, to the psyche, to the soul. Colonialism didn't just take land, it took identity. Imagine waking up one morning and being told your name, your language, your ancestors, your gods, your entire way of being were primitive, that everything you believed in was wrong, that the very color of your skin was a curse. This was not just conquest, it was psychological warfare. Across Africa, this wound cut deep. Colonial education systems were not built to enlighten, they were designed to erase. African children were taught about Napoleon before Shaka Zulu, about Joan of Arc before Ya Asantewaa. The histories of ancient Mali, Songhai, Kush were either dismissed or distorted. European civilization was upheld as the pinnacle of human achievement. African cultures were ridiculed, demonized, or simply ignored. This wasn't ignorance. It was a deliberate strategy. If you can make someone believe they are inferior, they will govern themselves accordingly. The church played its part. Missionaries came with Bibles in one hand and contempt in the other. Indigenous spiritual systems were branded as witchcraft, their priests called heathens. Entire cosmologies were replaced with foreign doctrines that told African salvation would come only by rejecting their heritage. Sunday school replaced the village oracle. Baptism erased ancestral names. In time, many Africans began to internalize this poison. Skin-lightening creams flew off the shelves. Straight hair was praised, kinky hair was unkempt. English and French accents became markers of intelligence. Names like Kwabena, Nandi and Chukwu were swapped for Peter, Mary and John. The colonizer was no longer just outside the gate, he had moved into the mind. This is what Kenyan writer Ngugi wa Thiong'o called the colonization of the mind. And it's the most dangerous kind because you don't see the chains, but you feel them every day. Even after independence, the damage lingered. In countries where tribes had coexisted for centuries, colonial borders forced artificial unity or fostered division. Hutus and Tutsis in Rwanda, Igbos and Hausas in Nigeria, Kikuyus and Luos in Kenya. Ethnic rivalries were stoked, weaponized and passed down through generations like family heirlooms. Self-hate morphed into tribalism, and tribalism became the cancer of nationalism. And then there was the language. To this day, many African nations conduct their business, pass their laws, and teach their children in colonial tongues. You cannot fully reclaim yourself when you are forced to speak in the voice of your oppressor. But the greatest casualty may have been unity. Before colonization, Africa was not one nation, but it was one people. Trade routes connected the Sahara to the Swahili coast. Empires rose and fell, but cultural exchange flourished. A traveller from Timbuktu could find kinship in Zanzibar. A merchant from Nubia could barter in Ifa. But colonialism fractured this cohesion. Borders were drawn like scars, dividing rivers, splitting tribes, and severing kin. Today, many Africans know more about Paris or London than they do about each other. African passports are more welcomed abroad than across neighbouring borders. Pan-Africanism, once a rallying cry, became a forgotten whisper. Yet through the cracks, light has begun to shine again. Artists began reclaiming ancestral forms. Writers dug deep into oral traditions, finding pride in proverbs, folklore and mythology. Musicians fused traditional rhythms with modern sounds, Afrobeats, Amapiano, highlife, echoes of a continent refusing to forget its song. Afrocentric education is rising. Institutions are being challenged. Histories are being rewritten. Not to erase the past, but to tell the truth about it. Young Africans are learning that Africa was not born in chains, that its story does not begin with slavery or colonization, that Mansa Musa was the richest man in history, that the walls of Great Zimbabwe still stand, that the University of Timbuktu was teaching while Europe was in the Dark Ages. They are learning to love their skin, to wear their names with pride, to speak their mother tongues not just at home but in public, in politics, in poetry. But healing is not linear. Colonial trauma is intergenerational. It manifests in policy, in prejudice, in poverty, in how we treat each other, in who we trust, in what we value. To break this cycle, Africa must confront the mirror, not just to mourn what was lost, but to remember what was stolen and to reclaim it. Identity is not static. It evolves, but it must be rooted. For a tree without roots cannot grow, it withers. Africa is regrowing its roots, slowly, painfully, beautifully. And in the soil of that regeneration, new symbols are rising. One of them is Traore, a name now whispered in the streets, painted on walls, sung in defiance. A symbol not of what Africa was, but of what it can be. But symbols are only as strong as the people who believe in them. And as we look ahead, the question is no longer, can Africa heal? It is, will we choose to?